The snow was coming down hard, wind howled across the empty highway, and in the middle of it all lay a tiny German Shepherd puppy, hit, bleeding, shivering. His little body barely moved, his eyes still open, still waiting. No one had stopped before, no one even noticed. But this man did, a man no one ever looked at twice. In Edmonton, Alberta, winter didn't simply arrive, it consumed. Snow fell like a silent army, blanketing streets, silencing cars, swallowing whole buildings in a thick white hush. The temperature had dropped to -27 that evening. Wind scraped its claws along the walls of narrow alleys, and the street lamps flickered like they too wanted to go home. Jonas Dale, 45 years old, stood in the faint orange glow of the loading dock sodium lights. His truck hissed in the cold, engine idling like a low growl. He tightened the straps on the cargo, blew into his cracked gloves, and climbed into the cab. He didn't speak. He almost never did. Jonas had been born with a stutter so severe that, by the age of 5, most adults had stopped asking him to talk. It wasn't just the stammer. It was the way words broke inside his throat, crumpled like paper before ever reaching his tongue. Teachers grew impatient. Foster families gave up. Eventually, so did he. He had no family. His father abandoned him at a gas station when he was 3. His mother came back for a while, then she left too. By the time he turned 10, Jonas knew how to pack his things in under a minute. Group homes, shared dorms, and eventually, the back of his own truck became more familiar than any bedroom. Speaking was optional. Driving was not. He'd been hauling goods for nearly 2 decades now, quietly, consistently, and without ever asking for much. That made him perfect for Carl Bender, the owner of Mid-North Freight. Carl was the kind of boss who wore the same greasy trucker hat every day, laughed too loudly at his own jokes, and shaved off hours from paychecks like bark from a log. He liked drivers who didn't complain. Jonas never did. Tonight, Jonas was on his second run, a last-minute delivery across the industrial belt outside the city. It was the kind of job most would turn down in this weather. Slick roads, low visibility, black ice hidden beneath fresh powder. But Jonas didn't say no. He couldn't afford to. Rent was due, again. The truck lumbered out of the depot, wipers screeching across a frosted windshield. The heater coughed weakly, spitting lukewarm air into the cab. Snow danced past the headlights like startled moths. Jonas leaned forward, squinting through the blur of white, fingers clenched tight around the wheel. 10 blocks out, just past an old railroad crossing, he saw it. At first, it looked like a lump of snow, slightly off-center in the lane. But as he drew closer, the shape trembled. He braked. The truck slid a few feet before groaning to a stop. Hazards on, door open, wind howling. Jonas stepped out into the night, his boots crunching on frozen slush. The wind cut through his jacket like broken glass. Lying in the middle of the road was a German Shepherd puppy, no more than 5 or 6 weeks old. Its back leg was twisted grotesquely beneath its tiny body, and blood had pooled around its belly, mixing with the snow to form a slushy, dark halo. The puppy's breathing was shallow. One eye blinked slowly, half-lidded, almost done. Jonas froze. The snow stung his face. His breath came in clouds. The pup stared at him with a quiet, painful clarity. There was no barking, no crying, just the soft whimper of something too weak to understand what was happening. He crouched, reached out a hand, then stopped. He had nothing. No blanket, no carrier, no money. He didn't even know if the animal hospital on 42nd Street was still open. And even if it was, what would they say when he showed up with no credit card, no insurance, and a half-dead puppy? His hand trembled. A memory surfaced. Him at 6, curled on the steps of the group home, holding his own busted knee after being pushed into the ice by another boy. No one came. He remembered the sound of his own shivering, the way the snow had tasted like salt. His eyes flicked back to the puppy. Still alive, but barely. Suddenly his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jonas flinched, startled. He pulled it out with stiff fingers. Text from Carl Bender. "Where the hell are you? Get that load dropped. B410 or I dock you 3 HRS. Jonas stared at the screen. The red light from the hazard blinked off the falling snow, painting everything in a pulse of warning. He looked down the road. Delivery site was 20 minutes away. He was already late. He looked back at the puppy. He exhaled through his nose, long, silent. Then he stood up, walked back to the truck, got in, closed the door. The cab was cold again, the heater wheezing uselessly. His hands gripped the wheel. Through the windshield, the snow kept falling. He put the truck in gear. He didn't look back. Jonas drove for exactly 12 minutes before the weight in his chest grew heavier than the storm outside. The road stretched ahead, featureless and white, headlights carving 2 weak tunnels through the snow, but he couldn't see. Not really. His hands were on the wheel, but his thoughts were miles behind, back on that patch of icy road where a tiny German shepherd puppy still lay bleeding. He clenched his jaw, trying to shake it off. The cargo mattered. Carl would dock his pay. He needed that money. The pup probably wouldn't survive the night anyway. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't a hero. He was a man with nothing. No one. The wipers squealed across the windshield. The heater coughed. His breath fogged the glass. Then, in the thick quiet of his cab, Jonas let out a low sound. Not quite a word. Not a cry. Just something broken that rose from his chest like steam. He pulled over. He sat still for a moment. Then, slowly, he turned the wheel and backed the truck around. The roads were slick, and his tires struggled for grip. The snow had thickened since he passed, rising now to his knees as he stepped out again into the freezing dark. He scanned the road, heart pounding. There, a lump in the snow, unmoving. Jonas ran. Not a graceful run, his boots slipping, legs stiff from cold, but a desperate one. The puppy hadn't moved much. The blood had stopped flowing, but its breathing was shallower now, eyes half closed, a faint twitch in one paw. Jonas peeled off his coat, thick and fraying at the sleeves, and gently wrapped the dog inside. His hands were shaking. Not from cold. Not entirely. He pressed the bundle close to his chest, shielding it from the wind, then climbed back into the cab and cradled it on his lap. The puppy let out a soft whimper, barely audible over the sound of the engine. Jonas shifted into drive. This time, he didn't care if he was late. He didn't even care if he got fired. There was only one place he could think of. A man named Dr. Emil Rowan. Jonas had heard the name before. Everyone in the neighborhood had. The old vet was a fixture in the local bulletin boards, retired now, but still known for helping strays and the pets of people with no money. They said his garage was a makeshift clinic, that he never turned away an animal in pain. Jonas didn't know the man, but he knew the street. 22 minutes later, Jonas pulled up in front of a small red brick house tucked behind an aging maple tree. A dim light glowed through frosted windows. There were wind chimes on the porch that didn't move in the storm, and a mailbox with faded letters that read, Rowan. Jonas stepped out, puppy still in his arms, and approached the door. He hesitated, then knocked. It took a while. When it finally opened, Dr. Emil Rowan stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy cardigan and flannel pajama pants, a knit hat pulled low over his ears. He was in his early 70s, tall but stooped, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a face that looked like it had been carved gently by time and kindness. He took one look at Jonas, then down at the coat in his arms. "What have we got here?" he asked, his voice rough but calm. Jonas opened his mouth, tried to speak, but only got out. Street? No one. Rowan didn't wait. Come inside. The garage had been converted into a clinic of sorts. An old examination table, worn counters, heat lamps, supplies neatly organized in plastic drawers. Jonas laid the bundle down as Rowan carefully peeled back the coat. "Puppy's young," he muttered, inspecting with delicate fingers. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Broken leg for sure, internal bruising, but no spine damage. That's a miracle. He looked up at Jonas. "You get him here quick?" Jonas nodded. "That probably saved him." Jonas shifted, hesitating. I can't pay." Rowan waved a hand. "Let me stop you right there. If it's alive and in pain, I help. That's the rule. Been the rule for 50 years. We'll sort the rest later." Jonas blinked. He didn't move. His hands stayed clenched, even as warmth returned to the room. The old man worked with practiced hands. He cleaned the wound, stabilized the leg with a tiny splint, set up a heat pad. At one point, he looked at Jonas and said, "He needs a name." Jonas frowned. Rowan smiled gently. "Can't very well keep calling him Puppy, now, can we?" Jonas looked down. The dog was asleep now, barely moving, curled tight as a comma. His fur was pale tan, almost creamy, with darker patches near the ears. One ear stood up. The other flopped like a broken flag. Jonas took a breath. Brisket. Rowan chuckled. Brisket, huh? You hungry or sentimental? Jonas almost smiled. Almost. While Rowan worked, snow continued to fall outside. Across town, behind a foggy window framed in ivy, a woman leaned on her balcony railing. Mira Lang, 28, lived alone in apartment 3C, just across from Jonas's unit. She was a reporter by trade, restless by nature, with sharp features and quicker instincts. Slender and tall, she had the kind of presence that made people speak plainly without knowing why. She'd moved to the complex 6 months ago, hoping to save money and find peace. Neither happened. Mira had noticed Jonas within days, the man with the old truck. Always silent. Always gone before sunrise. She'd watched him some mornings from her balcony, coffee in hand, wondering what his story was. He never looked up. That night, she didn't see him return. But when she opened her door to check the snow depth, she noticed fresh boot prints leading to Unit 2. B. A set of smaller prints followed beside them, half-finished, as if something had been dragged or carried. She tilted her head, and then she went back inside. Snow clung to the edges of Jonas's boots as he trudged up the steps to his apartment, a bundled figure clutched in his arms. Brisket was wrapped snugly in a second-hand fleece blanket, his eyes still groggy from the medication Dr. Rowan had administered. The small German Shepherd puppy had survived the night, but only barely. His injuries were extensive: fractured pelvis, torn ligaments in his right hind leg, and several bruised ribs. Dr. Rowan had warned Jonas gently with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who had stitched up more broken things than most people ever saw. "He'll live," the old vet had said, "but he might never run like other dogs. Not properly." Jonas had simply nodded. He hadn't expected anything more. In his world, survival was already a luxury. Normality was a foreign land. Brisket weighed very little, but Jonas held him like something precious. Once inside his apartment, a narrow, dim space with water stains on the ceiling, and a floor heater that clicked louder than it heated, he placed Brisket gently into a cardboard box lined with an old flannel shirt. The pup gave a tiny yawn, licked his nose, and curled up into himself like a question mark. Jonas sat back on the worn couch, rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, and let out a long breath. His coat still smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. On the chipped table beside the couch sat a tin of cheap soup, unopened. He hadn't eaten since the day before, but somehow he didn't feel hungry. That night, and every night that followed for the next week, Jonas cared for Brisket with the kind of quiet dedication most people only reserved for those who had never hurt them. He used scraps of fabric to create makeshift slings to help the pup move around. He spoon-fed him mashed chicken and warm water, speaking in soft, broken syllables that Brisket never seemed to mind. Brisket. Good boy. The puppy, despite the pain and the immobility, never once growled. He was small, cream-colored, with darker fur beginning to shade his ears and back as the days passed. His eyes were too large for his face, always searching, always soft. One leg dragged slightly when he tried to stand, but his tail wagged when Jonas entered the room. A slow, determined wag, like he was still learning how joy worked. And Jonas found himself smiling more. Not wide, not easily, but real and rare. Across the street, Mira Lang watched from her balcony. She was careful not to stare too openly, but curiosity had long since overridden propriety. She had always been drawn to silence, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that hinted at deep unspoken storms. Jonas embodied that kind of silence. She was 28, tall, with dark brown eyes that missed nothing. Her curls were usually tucked into a beanie, and she wore oversized jackets that swallowed her frame. Mira had grown up in Calgary, the daughter of 2 civil engineers who believed in logic more than love. As a teenager, she discovered that stories had more power than equations. She became a reporter to find the truths people buried under silence. For weeks now, she had observed Jonas and his quiet rituals, the early departures, the solitary dinners, the way he paused sometimes on the stairs, as if unsure whether he belonged where he was. When she first saw the small shape limping behind him days earlier, she thought it was a stray. But then came the box, the slings, the slow routine of care. She asked the building super, an elderly man named Dale with a fondness for neighborhood gossip, and got more than she bargained for. "Jonas? Bit of a ghost, that one," Dale had said. "No family. Been here 4 years. Pays rent on time. Keeps to himself. Stutters real bad. Think his boss cheats him too." Mira started digging. She had a burner Instagram account for these kinds of stories. Small moments of humanity the world often overlooked. That night, she took a discreet photo through her window. Jonas kneeling beside Brisket, lifting him gently onto a low cushion near the heater. There was no flash. No posing. Just a man with work-worn hands and a gaze more tender than she thought possible. The caption was simple. "He speaks in broken words, but when this injured puppy was left to die in the snow, he didn't hesitate. He took him home, named him Brisket, and has cared for him every hour since. No money, no family, just kindness." She tagged it #SilentHero. She didn't use his full name. She just called him Jay. Then she closed the app and went to bed. By morning, the post had over 20,000 likes. Within 48 hours, it had reached 500,000. People began asking who Jay was, where he lived, how they could help. Someone offered to send a wheelchair harness for the puppy. Another offered vet supplies. A well-known pet rescue foundation reposted the photo with a donation link that Mira hadn't even set up. Jonas, meanwhile, had no idea. He was too busy trying to figure out how to afford another tin of dog food without skipping dinner. Carl had left 3 angry voicemails that week, each more insulting than the last. Jonas hadn't answered any of them. He had, however, begun practicing a sentence out loud, over and over. "I'm quitting." He hadn't said it yet, but the words were forming, slowly, like thawing ice. That night, as Jonas sat beside Brisket's box, gently rubbing the pup's ear, while snow fell in quiet sheets outside, there was a knock at the door. He froze. No one ever knocked. He stood, opened it, and blinked in surprise. Mira stood there, holding a bag of groceries in one hand and a small bundle of newspapers in the other. Her cheeks were red from the wind, and she gave him a smile that wasn't pitying, just kind. "Hi," she said. "I'm Mira. I live across the way. You don't know me, but I think a lot of people are about to." The wind outside had softened, the snow now falling in lazy spirals over Edmonton's rooftops, but inside Jonas's apartment, everything felt loud. Not in sound. No, his home was still quiet, still wrapped in that familiar hush, but in motion, in energy, in the flood of unexpected attention suddenly directed at a man who had built his life around not being seen. It started with the groceries Mira brought over. Then came the emails. She'd posted a follow-up. Another photo, this time of Brisket awkwardly propped up on a stack of pillows, his large ears flopped sideways, tongue slightly out. The caption read, "He still can't walk, but he's trying. And the man who saved him? He still stutters, but he's speaking more, softly, to a dog who listens better than most people ever did." That post passed 1,000,000 likes in just under 2 days. Jonas didn't own a computer. His phone was a cracked, older model, and he only used it for directions and Carl's occasional screaming texts. Mira had to explain what was happening. She did it gently, sitting cross-legged on his worn couch with a steaming mug of cocoa between her palms. Jonas sat beside her, hands stiff in his lap, Brisket curled at his feet like a breathing scarf. "The story's everywhere," Mira said. "People love it. Brisket. It's like you both gave people something to believe in again." Jonas blinked, his lips parted, but no words came. Mira tilted her head. "You okay?" He tried. I didn't mean for... He trailed off. "I know," she said, smiling softly. "But maybe it's good. Maybe people need to see that not all heroes look or sound like they expect." Jonas looked down at Brisket, who thumped his tail once against the floor. Mira was patient. She never rushed him to speak. She filled silences not with pity, but with kindness. And over time, Jonas found he didn't mind her presence. She asked about his work, his history, even if she already knew the headlines. He shared pieces slowly. His favorite childhood snack, cornbread, the first job he ever held, dishwasher, the place he'd always wanted to visit but never dared, Vancouver Island in spring. She didn't flinch at his stutter. She just listened. And the world, outside their small orbit, kept spinning louder. Jonas began receiving mail, handwritten letters, dog treats, even a small handcrafted sweater for Brisket. Mira screened the offers that came pouring in. Podcasts, interviews, brand partnerships, charity pitches. Jonas said no to nearly everything. He didn't want fame. He just wanted Brisket to get better. But one request stood out. CBC Edmonton had reached out. Local news. Nothing flashy. A 5-minute segment on everyday acts of kindness. Mira thought it was harmless. They'll pre-record, she assured him. No pressure, just sit. Maybe hold Brisket. Say a few words if you want. Jonas didn't answer right away. The idea of cameras, lights, people watching, it made his skin prickle. Still, Mira's tone was hopeful, and when she smiled, he found it hard to say no. So, he agreed. The interview was scheduled for Saturday morning. A small crew arrived, just 3 people, friendly and casual. The reporter was a woman in her late 40s named Lana Grove, with graying curls, soft eyes, and a voice like she'd once been someone's favorite bedtime story narrator. She dressed in muted layers, comfortable shoes, and asked permission before entering Jonas's space. Brisket, now able to sit up for short periods, immediately waddled over to sniff her boots and was rewarded with a quiet laugh. "Oh, he's got opinions," she said, crouching to scratch behind his ears. Jonas nodded, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had dressed carefully, clean flannel, jeans with no holes, even trimmed his beard the night before. Mira sat nearby, sipping coffee and giving him a quiet thumbs up. The crew set up quickly, unobtrusively. They made no sudden movements. The lights weren't too bright. Still, Jonas's throat tightened the moment the camera turned on. Lana began gently. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened the night you found Brisket?" Jonas opened his mouth, closed it. He began, and stopped. Brisket let out a small, encouraging bark from beside his feet. Jonas looked down. The pup's gaze was steady, trusting. He tried again. Was Snow, bleeding?" He faltered. Lana waited. Everybody drove past," he finally said. Tears stung the corners of his eyes, not from shame, but from the unbearable effort of dragging words out of a throat not made for smooth talking. He looked away. Lana leaned forward. "That's enough, really. That's more than enough." They continued with shots of Brisket playing with a donated stuffed raccoon, a few scenes of Jonas gently lifting the puppy's leg to adjust a brace. Mira was interviewed briefly too, speaking with clarity and conviction about why kindness, especially from quiet places, mattered. When the crew packed up, Lana touched Jonas's shoulder lightly. "You're a good man," she said, "not because of the dog, but because you didn't ask for any of this." That night, the segment aired. The headline read, "The Silent Trucker and the Pup He Refused to Leave Behind." By Monday, Jonas's name was everywhere. He didn't like it. He didn't hate it either. Mostly it made him feel exposed. But then Brisket barked, just once, loud and clear, when he saw Jonas watching himself on screen. And Jonas laughed, out loud. Later that week, Mira invited him out to a local cafe. It was small and quiet, with bookshelves instead of TVs, and a fireplace in the corner. She wore a green scarf wrapped twice around her neck, her curls wild from the wind. They sat together in a booth by the window. Brisket was allowed in, tucked in a sling beside Jonas's feet. The barista, a lanky young man named Tom, with a pierced eyebrow and genuine smile, brought over warm drinks on the house. "You've got fans," Mira teased. Jonas shook his head, cheeks flushed. "You don't need to talk," she said, sipping her chai. "You've already said more than most people ever do." They sat in silence for a while. The good kind. Jonas looked at her. Thank you," he said. Mira smiled. "You're welcome, Jay." It had been 3 weeks since the interview aired, and the snowfall in Edmonton had begun to ease. The ice still clung to gutters and sidewalks, but the sky was softening into pale blue, and the edges of winter were starting to blur. Jonas stood on his small porch in a threadbare hoodie, Brisket curled at his feet on an old wool blanket, soaking in the muted sunlight, like a cat that didn't know he was still healing. Jonas looked down at him with something that resembled pride. The little German shepherd had grown stronger. Though his back legs still lagged when he walked, he was no longer dragging it. Dr. Rowan had provided a soft harness to support his gait, and Jonas practiced daily, walking him back and forth across the parking lot, with the patience of a man who had finally found something worth investing time in. It was during one of those walks that Mira showed up again, her coat cinched tight, breath fogging in the air. She held a manila envelope in one hand and a look on her face that Jonas couldn't quite read. Brisket barked once in greeting, short, excited. Mira crouched to scratch behind his ears. "I found them," she said quietly. Jonas's chest tightened. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Mira straightened, offered him the envelope. "I didn't go looking to hurt anyone. I just thought you might want to know." Inside were printouts, screenshots of an old pet adoption post, a thread from a local forum. The photo showed a younger Brisket, just a fluffball at the time, between the feet of a young couple. The man had scruffy blonde hair and a sheepish grin, arms tattooed and poorly concealed beneath a frayed flannel. The woman had tight curls, long legs, and an effortless camera-ready smile. Beneath the image was a message. "Meet Whiskey, our little troublemaker. He eats shoes and chases leaves, and we love him more than pizza." Jonas sat down on the porch steps, the envelope limp in his hands. Mira knelt beside him, her voice low. They were called Brian and Tessa. They lived on 83rd, lost their jobs during the pandemic. Foreclosure hit. Moved in with family across the province. No one knew what happened to the dog until someone saw Tessa post anonymously on a forum, said they left him because shelters were full, said she cried about it, but they still left him, just on the road. Jonas didn't speak, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He looked down at Brisket, who was now nosing a twig with the same innocent curiosity he brought to everything. I was thrown away," Jonas said after a long silence, twice. Mira didn't flinch. "I know," she said. He didn't raise his voice, but his hands trembled. "They didn't even slow down," he muttered. "Just left him hurt." Mira touched his arm. "You're allowed to be angry, Jonas." "I don't know how." But he did. He felt it. A deep burn rising in his throat. New, unfamiliar, rage. He had seen plenty of cruelty in his life, but this felt different. It wasn't the world being cruel to him. It was the world being cruel to someone he loved. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stayed on the couch, Brisket curled into the crook of his knees, and stared at the ceiling until morning. But when the sun rose, something inside him settled. He made coffee, fed Brisket, stepped outside, and decided not to look for the couple. What would it do? Confront them? Demand an apology they'd never mean? He looked down at Brisket, now stronger, playful, waiting with a tug of leash between his teeth. "No," Jonas whispered. "You're here. That's enough." Later that week, Jonas took Brisket to the park. It was still slick in places, but kids had begun returning to the swings and benches. One boy stood off to the side near a frozen water fountain. He couldn't have been older than 7, short, with a too big winter coat and gloves that made his arms stick out like branches. He had a nervous posture, shoulders tight, eyes wary. As Jonas walked by, Brisket's tail wagged. The boy flinched. His mother, a tall, tired-looking woman with deep circles under her eyes and a lopsided beanie, called from a bench nearby. "It's okay, Sammy. He's friendly." The boy didn't move. Jonas stopped, looked down at Brisket. Then gently he knelt and removed the leash. Brisket looked at him, ears perked. Go, Jonas said softly. The puppy trotted over. The boy stiffened, but Brisket didn't run. He walked slowly, tail swishing low. When he reached Sammy, he sat. Just sat. After a full minute, the boy extended one hand. Brisket licked it. The boy giggled. Quiet, surprised. Jonas didn't smile often, but that day, he did. Mira arrived 10 minutes later, camera slung across her chest. She watched the interaction from a distance before lifting her lens. One snap, then another. "Do you mind?" she asked Jonas. He shook his head. By evening, the image was posted. Brisket, tail wagging, nuzzling the outstretched hand of a boy labeled, "Afraid of dogs since a bite at age 4. The comments poured in again. Teachers, therapists, parents of shy children, all moved by a moment of trust between fur and fingers. Jonas read them slowly, lips moving as he did. Not because he wanted validation, but because for the first time in his life, he felt useful. Not tolerated. Not overlooked. Useful. The next morning, he and Mira sat on the curb outside the cafe, their drinks steaming between them. Jonas was learning to enjoy silence when it wasn't empty. Mira nudged him. "You're doing okay, you know." He nodded. "Thank you," he murmured. "Anything you'd change?" she asked. Jonas looked at Brisket, who was now trying to chew his own paw, then at Mira. He shook his head. Just this." Jonas was pouring lukewarm water into Brisket's bowl when the knock came. It wasn't tentative like Mira's, or hurried like a delivery driver's. It was sharp, impatient, a knuckle against metal kind of knock. Brisket barked once and tilted his head. Ears pricked. Jonas dried his hands on the hem of his sweatshirt and opened the door. Standing on the threshold was Carl Bender. Same old Bender. Stocky, red-faced, hair slicked back with too much gel, wearing a leather jacket that didn't quite zip over his stomach. A cigarette hung loosely from his lips, unlit for once. His smile was stretched too wide, too white. Jonas hadn't seen him since the day he walked away from Mid-North Freight, but somehow the man looked even more like a cartoon villain now. Well, Carl said, arms outstretched like they were old buddies. "Look who made it on TV." Jonas stood stiffly, hand tightening on the doorframe. He managed, but the rest caught in his throat. Carl breezed past him without being invited in. He scanned the apartment with a quick, judgmental sweep. Jonas felt a flush crawl up his neck as Carl's gaze lingered on the second-hand furniture and peeling paint. "This the mutt?" Carl crouched and clicked his tongue at Brisket, who growled low. "Still got some attitude, huh?" Jonas stepped protectively in front of the dog. Carl stood and raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax. I'm not here to steal your dog." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded packet of papers. "I'm here with a proposition. You and me, we've got history. You were a damn good hauler. Quiet, loyal, dependable. Now, the world thinks you're some kind of saint, which is great because I just so happen to need a face for our new campaign." Jonas stared at the packet. His mouth moved, but no sound came. Carl continued undeterred. "Picture this. Mid-North Freight, driven by heart. We put your story on our trucks. You pose with the pup. We shoot a few ads, maybe a video or two. Hell, I'll even toss you a decent check." Jonas looked at Brisket, who had retreated to the corner, staring at Carl with quiet suspicion. Jonas swallowed hard. His pulse thudded in his ears. I don't, he began. Carl sighed dramatically. "Look, I get it. You're not good with words. That's why we'll handle the talking. You just show up, pet the dog, smile a little, that's it." Jonas clenched the edge of the door. He didn't want this. He didn't want Carl anywhere near his life again. But the man's confidence was overwhelming, and Jonas's fear of confrontation, still rooted deep in childhood, made it hard to push back. "I'll leave the papers," Carl said, already placing them on the kitchen table. "Think it over, but don't wait too long. The media cycle doesn't wait for anyone." And just like that, he left. The door clicked shut, but Jonas still felt like Carl's presence lingered, oily and unwelcome. He stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do, the documents sitting on the table like something venomous. When Mira arrived an hour later with fresh bread from the Saturday market, Jonas didn't say anything at first, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the untouched food on the counter. She asked. He gestured toward the papers. She flipped through them quickly, lips tightening. "Jonas," she said gently, "this is exploitation. He doesn't care about you or Brisket. He just sees attention and wants to milk it." Jonas nodded. Don't want to, but I don't know how to say no." Mira sat beside him. "Then let's write an email, a firm, polite no." Jonas looked panicked. I can't." "You don't have to write it," she said. "Just sit with me while I do." He nodded slowly. Mira opened her laptop and began typing. "Dear Mr. Bender, thank you for reaching out. However, Jonas will not be participating in any marketing campaigns at this time. He respectfully declines your offer and asks that you refrain from contacting him further. Best, Mira Lang, on behalf of Jonas Dale." She looked at him. "Too harsh?" Jonas shook his head. "Send." Mira clicked. Done. Later that night, she was working on her article about the ongoing impact of Brisket's story when she heard soft noises from Jonas's apartment across the hall. She knocked gently. He opened the door and held out a phone. I wanted to try," he said. Mira blinked. "Try what?" He pointed to a small recording app on his phone. For the community podcast. They asked. Her eyes widened. You said yes? He gave a tiny nod. Want to say something? She stepped inside and sat across from him. Brisket lay at Jonas's feet, eyes half-lidded, tail slowly thumping. Jonas opened the app. He cleared his throat, pressed record, and started. Hi. I'm Jonas. Don't talk well, but I want to say thank you. Not just for me, but for Brisket. He was left, but he's still here, and so am I. He stopped, breathed in. I didn't know people would care. I never thought I'd matter, but now I want to help. I'm trying to thank you. He hit stop. Mira was smiling through tears. That was perfect. He flushed, ears red. No, but it was me. She nodded. Exactly. That recording would later be played at a local youth center event focused on resilience. It wasn't polished, and the stutter was there, unhidden. But the room had gone still when it played, and no one in that room ever forgot it. Jonas didn't listen to it again. He didn't have to. He was already living it. It began with a shiver, not the playful, twitchy kind Brisket gave when dreaming of rabbits or tug-of-war ropes, but a violent, unnatural tremble that traveled from his hind legs up through his fragile frame. Jonas had been folding laundry on the couch when he heard the low whimper and looked up to see Brisket lying sideways on the rug, his breathing shallow, eyes glassy, and his little body too still, except for the tremors. Panic moved through Jonas like electricity. He dropped the shirt he was folding and slid to his knees beside the pup, his hands shaking as he touched Brisket's forehead and felt the alarming heat radiating off his skin. The thermometer, an old digital one he had picked up at a dollar store, blinked in red, 40.3 degrees Celsius. Jonas had no formal knowledge of veterinary thresholds, but instinct screamed that this was far too high. With trembling hands, he bundled Brisket into a blanket, cradling him against his chest, and ran out into the snow-covered evening without even locking the door. The animal emergency clinic was across town, tucked between a shuttered diner and a pawn shop with a flickering neon sign that read VT24. The waiting room was dimly lit, walls painted in muted greens, and the smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Jonas burst in, red-faced, cradling the pup, unable to form coherent words as he tried to explain. The young woman behind the reception desk, who wore oversized glasses and had bright purple hair, immediately called for a tech. Brisket was taken from Jonas's arms, and he stood frozen, his coat half unzipped, breath shallow as the world tilted. A vet tech named Tyler, mid-20s, pale with dark circles, and a quiet, clipped efficiency, asked a few questions, gently ushered Jonas to sit down, and told him someone would be out shortly. Then he disappeared behind the swinging doors with Brisket. Jonas sat in the corner chair, still wearing his boots, snow melting in puddles at his feet. He couldn't stop wringing his hands, fingers twitching with helpless energy. Time stretched thin. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there when the chair beside him creaked. She was small, almost bird-like, with a hunched frame wrapped in layers of shawls. Her coat was a faded wool blend, forest green with frayed cuffs, and her knitted hat sagged to one side. Her eyes, though, were sharp, gray and piercing, the kind of eyes that had watched decades pass and still missed nothing. She carried a woven carrier bag beside her, the soft mewl of a cat barely audible from within. "You're the trucker," she said, not unkindly, but with the bluntness of age. "The one with the dog from the snow." Jonas blinked, startled. She gave a crooked smile. "My niece showed me the video on that Tic Tac or whatever. That little dog looked just like mine when he was young." Jonas cleared his throat, trying to respond, but only managed a tight nod. "I'm Rose Kavanaugh," she said, holding out a gloved hand. "This is Marvin." She tapped the side of the carrier. Jonas shook her hand gently. "I had a dog once," she said, settling into the seat like she had known it her whole life. "He was old and stubborn, like my late husband. Got cancer. I held him when they gave him the shot. Never had another dog after that. Got Marvin here instead. Cats don't love you the same, but they don't leave you either." Jonas glanced at the swinging door. No one had come out. Rose tilted her head. "You worried?" He nodded. "What's his name?" Brisket. That's a good name, she said. Comfort food. Strong name for a little fighter. There was a pause, quiet but not uncomfortable. My father was a butcher, she added. He named one of our dogs Oxtail. My mother hated it. Jonas managed a small sound, half laugh, half wheeze. Rose looked at him kindly. We don't talk much about how hard it is to lose things that don't speak our language. They understand everything, but we don't get to ask them if they're scared. That's what kills me. Jonas nodded, throat tight. They're more than pets. They're buffers, between us and the silence. Jonas looked at her sharply. She'd just named something he hadn't been able to. For the next hour, they sat together. She talked about her garden, about Marvin's obsession with television nature shows. Jonas told her, slowly and haltingly, about the day he found Brisket in the road. She listened without interrupting, her expression soft but never pitying. Finally, the door opened. Tyler stepped out, clipboard in hand. His eyes found Jonas immediately. "Mr. Dale?" Jonas stood too fast, knees weak. "He's stable," Tyler said. "Severe infection, likely internal from old trauma. It flared fast. We've got him on fluids and antibiotics. He'll stay overnight, but we're cautiously optimistic." Jonas exhaled, collapsing into the nearest chair like his legs had been holding back a flood. Tyler put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, bringing him in when you did." Rose squeezed Jonas's hand once. "You'll be okay, both of you. He's not ready to go, and neither are you." Jonas didn't reply. He just nodded again, slowly, eyes stinging. They let him sit beside Brisket for a few minutes. The pup was hooked up to IVs, his breathing labored but less erratic. Jonas sat in silence, one hand on the blanket draped over Brisket's side. When the tech returned, Jonas left the room, moving like someone older than his years. At the exit, Rose waited, Marvin's ears just poking from the carrier. "You come by the senior center sometime," she said. "We do puzzles. Talk about the news like it matters. You'd fit right in." Jonas smiled, tired but grateful. Oh, okay." They parted in the snow. That night, Jonas didn't sleep. He sat on the couch with the blanket Brisket usually used draped over his knees. In his lap, a photo Mira had printed. Brisket in the snow, eyes wide and hopeful. The longest night of Jonas's life passed in quiet waiting. The snow had started to melt in patches along the sidewalks, exposing muddy strips of grass and the stubborn grit the city had scattered weeks earlier. Jonas stood by the window, watching as a pair of crows pecked at something near the dumpster behind the apartment complex. Brisket, newly returned from his ordeal at the animal hospital, lay dozing in a patch of weak sunlight near the heater, his body thinner, but his breath steady. Jonas sipped lukewarm tea from a chipped mug and tried not to replay the night he'd thought he might lose the dog that had taught him how to feel again. It was late afternoon when Carl came back. No knock this time, just a heavy fist on the door and a voice that still had that condescending lilt, like he was talking to a child. "Jonas, buddy, open up. I got news you're going to want to hear." Jonas didn't move at first. He'd hoped Carl had taken the previous message seriously, the firm, polite rejection Mira had crafted and sent on his behalf, but apparently not. Carl was the kind of man who saw boundaries as mere suggestions. With a deep breath, Jonas opened the door just enough to look out. Carl stood there in his black wool coat, a flashier version of his usual trucker attire, slicked back hair gleaming, a phone in one hand, and a manila folder tucked under his arm. "Look," Carl said before Jonas could even speak, "I get it. Last time I came off a little eager. That's on me. I should have been more respectful. But now I've got a real offer, solid, professional, big time." He held out the folder like it was some kind of sacred text. "We're talking full media rollout, billboards, local TV spots, from truck to triumph, the Brisket story. You and the dog, front and center. People eat this stuff up, man. Heartwarming stories, redemption arcs. We'll even donate part of the ad revenue to an animal shelter, just to keep things squeaky clean. Everybody wins." Jonas didn't take the folder. He looked at Brisket, who had now lifted his head and was watching Carl with the same distrust he'd shown the last time. Jonas's hands curled slightly at his sides. No," he said, and it came out stronger than he expected. Carl blinked. "Sorry?" Jonas stepped out onto the landing, door still half open behind him. His voice trembled, but not with fear. with effort. No, said no. I'm not your marketing tool. Carl chuckled, clearly thinking this was a joke. Jonas, come on. You don't want to be scraping by your whole life. This is real money, security, and the mutt gets famous. Jonas straightened. His heart pounded so hard it echoed in his ears. But he didn't back down. He's not a mutt. He's family. Carl opened his mouth to retort, but seemed to catch something in Jonas's eyes that gave him pause. For a moment, the slickness dropped. He tucked the folder back under his arm, sneered a little. Fine. Enjoy your 15 minutes, hero. Then he turned and walked away, boots crunching on the still frozen gravel. Jonas closed the door and leaned against it, his whole body buzzing. It was the first time in his life he had looked someone in the eye, said no, and meant it. Brisket hobbled over, tail wagging lazily, and leaned into his leg. Jonas knelt, buried his face in the dog's fur, and exhaled shakily. He didn't know what came next, but he knew what wouldn't. Carl, manipulation, silence. That evening, Mira stopped by with a small cake from the bakery on 99th Street, the kind with lemon glaze and too much sugar. She was wearing a wool hat, cheeks red from the wind, and a smile that warmed the room more than the space heater ever could. So, I heard from a neighbor that Carl came by again, she said, setting the cake on the table. You okay? Jonas nodded. Told him no. Her eyes widened, then softened. Jonas, that's huge. I'm proud of you. She took a seat and opened her tablet. So, I posted a little something, just a story about how you stood your ground today. No names, no drama, just the heart of it. People need to hear about quiet courage. She turned the screen toward him. The post had already gone semi-viral. Comments flooded in. Words like integrity, bravery, and this man gives me hope. Jonas stared at it, stunned. He hadn't expected anything from a single act of self-respect. But it rippled outward, like everything else. 2 days later, a letter arrived. A real one. Envelope, stamp, even a return address. Mira read it aloud at Jonas's request. It was from the Maple Paws Rescue Trust, a respected nonprofit that specialized in rehabilitation and fostering of abused animals. The director, Eleanor Green, had watched the interview, followed Mira's posts, and listened to Jonas's recorded message at the community event. She wrote with warmth, grace, and a sincerity Jonas could feel even without seeing her face. She wanted to invite Jonas to become a community ambassador. No gimmicks, no PR exploitation, just a voice, in whatever form he could give it, to represent healing, perseverance, and second chances. Jonas didn't answer right away. He sat with the letter for a night, fingers tracing the textured paper, heart caught between the old instinct to disappear and the new desire to step forward. Mira waited, no pressure. Finally, he said, Yes, I want to help. Brisket barked once, as if to seal it. The last of the snow was melting in thin ribbons along the edge of the sidewalk, pooling into slush that glinted under the soft glow of a late spring sun. Edmonton had begun its slow thaw, and the city smelled of wet earth and promise. The park near Jonas's apartment, once buried in a sea of white, now revealed patches of yellowed grass and budding trees hesitant to bloom. Jonas stood by the edge of the park path, with his hands tucked into the deep pockets of his faded canvas jacket, watching Brisket sniff at the base of a lamppost with intense concentration. The German Shepherd pup, now 6 months old, had grown into his oversized paws and lanky legs. His fur had thickened into a warm caramel coat with black streaks on his back and ears, and his body, though still bearing a faint limp, was stronger, surer. Brisket's eyes held that same fierce intelligence, tempered now with joy, and the world no longer felt like something to flinch from. Jonas had taken him here every morning since the vet cleared him for light exercise. At first, they had just walked a few cautious loops around the grass. Brisket moved slow, dragging his once-shattered leg slightly behind, determined but uneven. Then the dragging stopped. Then the limp lessened. Today, Brisket's movements had a new rhythm. He was walking without aid, without a harness, and when a squirrel darted across the path 10 feet ahead, something changed. Brisket barked, once, sharp and delighted. Then he ran. Jonas's breath caught in his throat as he watched his dog, his miracle, lunge forward in an unbalanced but ecstatic sprint. The back leg still wasn't perfect. It kicked outward awkwardly with each stride. But Brisket didn't care. He was running, actually running, for the first time since Jonas found him bleeding in the road. And in that moment, Jonas stopped breathing. His hands dropped from his pockets. His knees went weak. And before he realized it, tears were slipping down his cheeks. Silent, unrestrained tears. He didn't wipe them away. He just watched. The sound of laughter pulled him back. To the right, near the jungle gym, Sammy was running too, short legs pumping, his red mittens flying from his pockets as he bounded after Brisket with the wild abandon only children can manage. Sammy had grown bolder these last few weeks. The boy who once froze at the sight of a dog now ran beside one like they'd been best friends forever. His cheeks were pink from the cold and excitement, his dark hair a mess beneath his puffy blue hat. Jonas took a slow step forward, just as Brisket stumbled in the grass, tripped over his own paws, and collided gently with Sammy. The boy toppled backward into a snowbank that hadn't quite melted. Brisket landed on his chest. Both of them let out surprised sounds. Sammy's a high-pitched squeal, Brisket's a delighted yip. Then, both started laughing. Sammy clutched Brisket in a hug, the dog licking his face furiously, tail thumping against the snow. The moment was so pure, so free of weight, that Jonas found himself laughing too. Quiet at first, then deeper, like something inside had snapped loose and found flight. He turned when he heard footsteps behind him. Mira had arrived. She wore a quilted olive green jacket and a scarf patterned in burgundy leaves. Her cheeks were rosy, and her curls escaped from under her knit beanie. She was holding 2 thermoses and offered one to Jonas with a smile. "Cinnamon tea," she said. "You look like you might be in a holy moment." Jonas took the thermos, still sniffling, eyes glassy. He ran. Mira glanced at Brisket, now bouncing around Sammy like a puppy possessed. Yeah, he sure did. They stood in silence, sipping tea, watching the unlikely pair. A voice called from across the park. "Sammy, don't forget your mittens." Jonas turned to see Lena, Sammy's mother, walking toward them. She was tall, with a gentle face and a quiet weariness in her shoulders. Her brown coat had seen better winters, and her boots were dotted with patches of salt stains. She was in her early 30s, hair tied back in a tired ponytail, and her tone carried the calm of a woman who had learned to be patient with life's many disappointments. She stopped a few feet away, glancing from Jonas to Mira, then down at Brisket and her son. "Hi," she said, a little breathlessly. I wanted to thank you both." Jonas tilted his head, unsure. Lena smiled. "For Brisket, and for letting my son near him. Sammy's been scared of dogs since one bit him outside his school 2 years ago. He still flinches when he hears barking. But Brisket, he's different." He waited. He didn't rush. He just let Sammy come to him. "I've never seen my boy this free." Jonas looked down, blinking hard. "He's good," he said. Mira offered a soft chuckle. "Both of them are." Lena hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket. "Look, I don't know if you're busy, but I'm cooking tonight. Just something simple. Beef stew, some cornbread. Would you both like to come over? I'd love to hear more about how Brisket came into your life. And I think Sammy would explode if he didn't get to share dinner with his furry best friend." Jonas looked to Mira, uncertain. She gave him a gentle nudge with her elbow. "We'd love to." Dinner at Lena's was warm, unpretentious, and filled with soft laughter and the clinking of ceramic bowls. The apartment was small but clean, filled with photographs of Sammy, framed school pictures, a clay handprint from preschool, and a single faded snapshot of Lena with a man who bore a resemblance to Sammy, but looked absent from more than just the room. Brisket lay curled under the table, content and calm, his tail occasionally twitching when Sammy reached down to stroke him. Over stew, Jonas told the story of the snowy night he found Brisket. He spoke slowly, haltingly, but Lena listened with the same attentiveness Mira always did. She didn't interrupt, didn't fill the pauses. She just let the story unfold. When they left that evening, Sammy hugged Brisket so tightly the dog squeaked in protest. Lena handed Jonas a small Tupperware container. "For tomorrow," she said, "and the day after, if you pace yourself." Jonas nodded. Thank you." "Any time," she replied. "Our door's always open." As they walked back under a night sky spattered with stars, Brisket trotting ahead like he had somewhere important to be, Mira took Jonas's arm gently. "You realize what today was, right?" He looked at her, puzzled. "His first run," she said, "but also your first step into other people's lives." Jonas didn't reply. He just looked at Brisket, then back at her and smiled. The air in Edmonton had turned warm and restless, the kind of spring wind that whispered change before the trees had even begun to bud. The city was shifting, slowly, stubbornly, from its frozen stillness into something looser, less defined. Jonas was sweeping the back steps of the apartment complex when the call came, though he didn't know it yet. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket, and as usual, he let it ring. Numbers he didn't recognize rarely brought anything good. He kept brushing the last of the grit and gravel left over from winter into a metal pan, pausing only to glance over his shoulder at Brisket, who was playfully pouncing on a stick in the grass, tail wagging furiously. The dog had recovered well from his long illness. He still limped when he was tired, but otherwise Brisket had grown into his body, a sturdy frame with a slight hunch to one side, and eyes that were wiser than any creature his age ought to have. He was Jonas's compass, his mirror, his home. It was only an hour later, sitting at the kitchen table while Brisket napped at his feet, that Jonas checked his voicemail. The message was short, scratchy, recorded in a weak voice that trembled with age. "Jonas, I know I don't have the right, but I'm in Calgary now, St. Agnes Hospice. They say it might not be long. I just thought, if you could, maybe you'd come." There was a pause, then a whispered, "I'm sorry," and a number. The voice was familiar in a way that made Jonas feel hollow. He hadn't heard it in over 30 years, yet it pulled something ancient and broken loose inside him. His mother. He stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then he put the phone down, got up, and paced the room, heart pounding harder with each step. The woman who had abandoned him, not once but twice, had called him now, at the edge of her life, after everything. After the rest stops, the group homes, the birthdays passed in silence. Now she wanted to see him. Now she wanted something. The conflict was instant, white-hot and sour in his throat. Jonas didn't speak to anyone that night, not even Brisket. He sat by the window long after dark, watching the headlights blur past and listening to the soft tick of the heater, the occasional snore from the dog at his feet. The city outside felt too big all of a sudden, too filled with choices he didn't know how to make. The next morning, Mira stopped by. She brought fresh rolls from the corner bakery, their paper bag already warm with butter and steam. Jonas tried to act normal, but she noticed his hands wouldn't stop twitching, and his eyes looked rimmed in something heavy. "Bad news?" she asked gently, pouring them both tea. Jonas hesitated, then handed her the phone and gestured toward the voicemail. She listened without speaking. When it ended, she looked at him for a long time before saying, "You don't have to go." Jonas nodded. "But I can't stop the thinking about it." That same afternoon, Brisket let out a yelp. They were walking through a side alley near the park when the dog darted too fast toward a rabbit and twisted sharply. His injured leg buckled and he dropped into the dirt with a high-pitched cry. Jonas was at his side in seconds, heart crashing against his ribs as he lifted Brisket's leg gently, checking for a break. It wasn't serious, but Brisket whimpered again, and Jonas felt something crack in himself. He carried Brisket home, hands shaking, as the dog nuzzled into his chest with confused trust. Back at the apartment, Jonas sat on the floor beside the dog for nearly an hour, his hand resting on Brisket's side as the pup slowly calmed. And as he stared into those familiar, searching eyes, something inside him shifted. Brisket didn't remember the road, the betrayal, the pain. He only saw Jonas, the man who stayed, who tried. He had no anger in him, only presence, only love. Jonas thought of his mother then, not as the villain she had once been in his mind, but as a woman, flawed, weak, maybe afraid, not right, not forgiven, but real, and dying. The anger didn't vanish, but it loosened, enough for him to breathe around it. He called the hospice that night. The receptionist, a kindly-sounding woman named Martha, confirmed his mother's condition. "She's alert, but not strong," Martha said. "She keeps asking if you'll come. I think it would mean the world, even if it's only for a little while." Jonas sat with the phone against his chest long after the call ended. He looked down at Brisket, who had limped over and rested his chin on Jonas's knee, tail thumping once. Jonas whispered, "Should we go?" Brisket's eyes met his, and Jonas had his answer. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of cracked asphalt, through fields still caught between frost and thaw, the gray skies above hanging low, heavy with unfinished snow. Jonas drove with both hands firm on the wheel, his fingers tense, knuckles white, but his expression unreadable. The old truck rumbled beneath them, a familiar rhythm that soothed his nerves only slightly. Brisket lay curled in the passenger seat, head resting on a folded sweatshirt, watching Jonas with his quiet, steady eyes. They had been on the road for 3 hours now, heading south toward a town Jonas hadn't spoken aloud in years. Stonebridge, small, rural, and full of ghosts. The last time Jonas had been here, he was 13. It had been the second goodbye. He remembered the train station, the way his mother had clutched his hand too tightly, and then not at all. She'd cried that day, but she still walked away. He remembered staring down at the rusted rails, wondering how long it would take for someone to realize he wasn't going home. The foster system had stepped in eventually, but by then, Jonas had learned the language of silence and survival. Now, decades later, he was returning. Not for her, not really, for himself. For the ache in his chest that refused to be ignored, for the tiny hope that some kind of answer, or at least an ending, waited beyond the town limits. St. Agnes Hospice sat at the edge of Stonebridge, tucked beside a frozen lake and a small grove of leafless birch trees. The building was newer than Jonas had expected, clean, glass-fronted, more comforting than clinical. He parked in the gravel lot, stepped out into the sharp wind, and opened the passenger door. Ready?" he asked quietly. Brisket stood, stretched his legs with a soft grunt, and stepped down beside him, tail swishing once in the cold. Inside, a woman at the front desk greeted him with a warm smile. Martha, the receptionist from the phone call, was in her 50s, round-shouldered, with curly white blonde hair tied back into a loose bun and a necklace of wooden beads resting on her cardigan. Her voice was gentle, well-practiced, the kind you heard in libraries and hospital wings. "She's been asking about you every morning," she said, guiding Jonas through a hallway that smelled faintly of lavender and hand sanitizer. "Hasn't eaten much, but she perks up when Brisket's name comes up." Jonas's throat tightened. He hadn't known she even knew the dog's name. They reached a small room at the end of the hall. Jonas paused at the door, hand resting on the frame. He took a deep breath, then stepped inside. The room was quiet. Pale blue curtains shifted gently at the windowsill. A woman lay in the bed. Small now, shrunken with illness, her once black hair faded to silver and pulled back in a loose braid. Her face was gaunt, but the bones were the same. Jonas saw his own eyes there, his own cheekbones. Her gaze lifted slowly, unsure at first, and then her lips trembled. "Jonas," she whispered, as if saying his name might break it. He stood still, unsure of what to do with his arms, with the pressure behind his ribs, with the memories crawling up his spine. She held out a trembling hand. "I didn't know if you'd come," she said. "I didn't know if I should." She nodded once, and tears slipped from the corners of her eyes. "You shouldn't. But I'm glad." Jonas stepped closer. Brisket patted ahead, gently placing his chin on the edge of the bed. His mother's eyes lit up at the sight, and she reached to touch the dog's head with shaking fingers. "I saw him. On the news," she said. "You saved him. Just like I couldn't save you." Jonas winced. "I wasn't good," she whispered. "I was scared. I was so young. After your father left, I didn't know how to be anything but broken." Jonas pulled a chair close and sat. He didn't say anything for a long time. "You didn't try," he finally said. She nodded. "I know, but I'm still here." She smiled through tears. "You are, and you're better than me." He shook his head. "I had help, late, but it came." She reached for his hand. He let her take it. "I just wanted to see your face," she said. "Once more, to know you weren't lost." "I was," he said, but not forever." They sat in quiet after that. She grew drowsy, her grip loosening, her breath uneven. Martha returned gently, placed a hand on Jonas's shoulder, and whispered that he could come back later if he needed. Jonas nodded, stood slowly, and let Brisket nuzzle the woman's hand one last time. Outside, dusk was falling. Jonas didn't drive back to Edmonton. Instead, He made a turn down an old gravel road that twisted behind a line of bare trees. He hadn't been there in decades, but his body remembered the way. The house had been abandoned for years. Peeling paint, boarded windows, sagging roof, but it was still standing. The place where he had learned to count, to hide, to wait for a mother who didn't always return. He pushed open the front door. It groaned like a tired memory. Inside, the air was stale with dust and damp wood. Jonas didn't explore. He just went to the old living room, where the fireplace still stood, cracked and charred. He spread out his coat on the ground, lay down beside Brisket, and looked up at the exposed beams above. "Want a story?" he murmured. Brisket rested his head on Jonas's chest, eyes half closed. Jonas began. There was a boy," he said. "He didn't know his worth. Everyone left him. He thought that meant he was broken." He stroked Brisket's ear. But one day, he found someone even more broken, and somehow they fixed each other. The wind moaned through the broken glass. Brisket sighed and closed his eyes. Jonas stared at the ceiling for a long time, heart quieter than it had been in years. Jonas returned to Edmonton under a sky swollen with snow. The wind had picked up steadily throughout the drive, turning familiar streets into tunnels of swirling white and frosting the edges of every storefront window. By the time he pulled into the parking lot behind his apartment complex, his truck's wipers were stiff with ice, and the world outside had gone silent under the weight of a coming storm. He cut the engine and sat for a moment. Brisket curled beside him on the passenger seat, watching the falling snow with calm curiosity. There was a stillness in the air that reminded Jonas of the kind before a hard blow, when the sky held its breath and the ground waited for the break. He had barely unpacked when the power flickered in his building. The radiator sputtered, the lights dimmed. Jonas wrapped a thick blanket around his shoulders, fed Brisket a bowl of warm broth, and turned on the old radio that sat beside the kitchen sink. A crackling voice warned of heavy snowfall, closed roads, and a plea for residents to check on vulnerable neighbors. He glanced out the window. The park across the street was already disappearing into the white. Trees leaned against the wind like they were tired of standing. An hour later, unable to sit still, Jonas bundled up and ventured outside. He didn't know what he was looking for, perhaps just a way to feel less trapped. Brisket trotted beside him, half buried in the snowdrifts, his thick fur catching flurries like powdered sugar. As they approached the edge of the park, Jonas saw movement near the benches, a cluster of shapes huddled beneath a graffiti-tagged gazebo. He moved closer and saw 2 adults and a teenage boy, all wrapped in makeshift layers of sleeping bags and trash bags, their faces red with cold and their eyes sharp with fatigue. Beside them, 3 dogs, mangy, thin, shaking, curled in a circle, pressed against each other for warmth. Jonas recognized the man first. Eddie, a wiry figure in his 60s, wore a patched military jacket and fingerless gloves. He'd seen him around town before, usually collecting cans or sleeping beneath bus stops. Eddie had a long beard, silver and tangled, and a voice rough from decades of smoke and wind. The woman beside him, Tamara, maybe mid-40s, had deep lines around her mouth, likely from years of clenching through pain. The boy, around 15, was skinny and watchful, with eyes too old for his face. His name was Leo, and he wore sneakers with holes stuffed with socks. They looked up as Jonas approached, cautious but not hostile. "Truck guy," Eddie said, squinting. "You're the one with the dog, the snow one." Jonas nodded. "No cameras, right?" No, Jonas said. Just me." Tamara coughed into her sleeve, and one of the dogs, a brindle mutt with a torn ear, whimpered. They can't stay here," Jonas said, gesturing at the worsening snow. You'll freeze." Eddie shrugged. "Been freezing since '97, friend." Jonas looked at the truck parked by the curb. It wasn't much. Rust-lined the doors, the back smelled faintly of old oil and coffee grounds, but it ran warm when the heater worked. He looked at Brisket, who stared at the huddled dogs and wagged his tail once. "I have room," Jonas said. Tamara looked up. "You serious?" He nodded. 15 minutes later, the truck's back had been cleared, Jonas pulling out tools and crates, spreading down old blankets. He helped them load in slowly. The 3 dogs came first, their ribs too visible, their eyes filled with suspicion, but not resistance. Then came the people. It was cramped, but warm. The heater clicked on, a miracle in itself, and the windows steamed. Jonas made another trip to his apartment, grabbing cans of soup, dog kibble, a second thermos of tea. He handed the thermos to Tamara, who drank like it hurt her jaw to open. Leo curled beside the dogs, arms wrapped around a greyhound mix that trembled like a tuning fork. Eddie sat behind the wheel with Jonas for a moment. "You don't owe us anything," he said. Jonas looked out at the snow. I know." "Still doing it anyway?" He nodded. "Good man," Eddie muttered. "Good damn man." Later that night, Mira stood by her window, camera in hand. She had returned from her sister's house an hour earlier and spotted Jonas's truck across the park, its lights still on, the silhouette of people inside. Her lens captured the faint glow of Brisket curled between two larger dogs, and Jonas stepping outside to shovel snow from under the tires. She didn't post it right away. Instead, she messaged Jonas. "Mira, you turned your truck into a shelter?" Jonas, just tonight, but better than freezing. Mira, people will want to help. Let me share?" There was a long pause, then Jonas, "Oh, okay." The photo Mira shared wasn't dramatic. It was grainy, low light, but honest. A man and his dog making room for others. The caption read, "When the storm hit, he didn't just stay warm. He made space for those who couldn't." This is Jonas. This is Brisket. This is what kindness in action looks like. The reaction was immediate. Blankets, food, offers of refurbished vans. One local vet promised to donate checkups for the rescued dogs. Someone from Calgary's animal outreach messaged, asking if they could replicate the idea. Within days, Jonas's inbox, still barely used, was full. But that night, Jonas didn't read messages. He sat in the cab with Eddie, the heater on full blast, Brisket asleep on his lap. Outside, the storm battered the city. Inside the old truck, it was quiet, warm, alive. The snow had mostly vanished now, retreating into patches of blackened slush and gutter runoff as spring edged forward. Edmonton's skies stayed gray, as if reluctant to allow real warmth. But the air smelled different, cleaner, sharp with thaw and rain. Jonas had returned to his quiet routines, though they were no longer the same. Each morning, Brisket nudged him awake with a cold nose and warm breath. Each day there was someone new knocking on his door. Neighbors with questions about the truck, donations for the shelter effort, people wanting to shake his hand, thank him. Jonas wasn't used to being seen, but he didn't flinch from it anymore. Not as much. The fire started on a Wednesday. It was early evening. Jonas had just returned from helping unload supplies for the local animal clinic, which now worked regularly with the mobile shelter project. He was rinsing off Brisket's muddy paws in the tiny bathtub when the dog suddenly froze. His ears twitched, head snapped toward the window, and he let out a low growl. Jonas stood still, listening. He didn't hear anything at first. Then it came, a faint, strange popping sound, followed by shouting. The hallway smelled like burnt plastic by the time he flung open his front door. Smoke curled from the stairwell, thin at first, then thicker. Someone screamed from upstairs. Jonas grabbed Brisket's leash without thinking, wrapped a damp towel over his mouth, and ran. The fire had started in Unit 4C, an old apartment with faulty wiring and a careless toaster left plugged into a cracked outlet. The tenant, an elderly woman named Sarah Callum, lived alone, tall and rail-thin, with silver hair kept in a loose braid and an arthritic gait. Sarah had been a fixture in the building for over 2 decades. She was known for her sharp tongue, endless collection of herbal teas, and her refusal to move out despite the increasingly questionable condition of the building. Jonas found her near her apartment door, coughing and clutching a canvas bag filled with prescription bottles. She was disoriented but lucid. "My cat," she rasped. "She's under the bed." Brisket, already barking now, sharp and insistent, led the way. Smoke had thickened by the minute, and Jonas had to stay low, eyes stinging. He found the cat, a scrawny orange tabby with one eye, hissing under the bed frame. Brisket whined, tail wagging low, and crouched beside the frame until the cat finally bolted and darted into Jonas's arms. The evacuation was chaos. Fire alarms had only partially worked, and the stairwell was already clogged with people, some in pajamas, some shouting for neighbors. Brisket barked relentlessly, guiding people with his sound, warning them before smoke crept into hallways. Jonas stayed near the stairs, banging on doors, helping guide the frightened down to the street. By the time fire trucks arrived, most of the building had made it out. Only one person was hospitalized for smoke inhalation. None lost to the flames. Unit 4C was gutted, and 2 others would need to be rebuilt, but it could have been worse. So much worse. The fire chief, a broad-shouldered woman with salt and pepper hair, and a calm that came from 30 years of catastrophe, shook Jonas's hand that night. Her name was Captain Myra Shaw, and she had the kind of voice that turned instructions into absolutes. "If it weren't for your dog," she said plainly, "we'd have had a body count." She knelt, scratched behind Brisket's ears. That bark saved lives. Jonas, soot-streaked and exhausted, just nodded. The press came the next morning. By then, photos from bystanders had made the rounds online. Brisket standing tall in the street, smoke curling behind him like war paint. Jonas in the background holding the orange tabby as if it were made of glass. The story spread quickly. Local hero dog saves apartment block. When the reporters arrived, Jonas didn't hide. He stood beside Mira in front of the building's battered facade, holding Brisket's leash. He spoke softly, haltingly, but without fear. He saved them. He knew before anyone. Mira stood beside him, calm and proud. She had covered every moment of this quietly unfolding story, from the snowstorm shelter to the fire. That same week, she received an email informing her that she'd been selected for the Edmonton Community Voice Award, honoring stories that inspired change and amplified unheard voices. The ceremony would be held at City Hall. Guests were invited. Mira asked Jonas to come with her. He hesitated. You should go alone," he said. Mira smiled gently. "But I didn't do it alone." The night of the ceremony, Jonas wore the only dress shirt he owned, blue, slightly wrinkled, borrowed from Eddie, who claimed it hadn't fit in 5 years, but still had dignity left in the collar. Mira wore a dark burgundy blouse and black slacks, her curls pinned back, face flushed with nerves and excitement. Brisket came too, freshly bathed, sporting a small red bandana Mira had tied around his neck. City Hall's reception hall was modest but bright, filled with community organizers, journalists, students, and activists. Jonas kept to the edges, but Mira stayed close. When her name was announced and the applause rose, she stepped up to the podium, cleared her throat, and smiled at the crowd. "I've been a journalist for 10 years, she began, and most of what I've written has been about people who don't make headlines, people whose stories live in the quiet places. But this past year, I met someone who taught me more than any interview ever could." She looked down at Jonas, who shifted nervously, but didn't break eye contact. Jonas Dale didn't ask for attention. He didn't want a spotlight. But he gave kindness when it mattered most, and he let us see it. That alone changed things, for me, for this city, for 100 small stories waiting to be heard. She gestured. "Jonas, would you come up here with Brisket?" The room quieted. Jonas froze. Brisket looked up at him, tail tapping softly. Then Jonas stood. He walked slowly up the steps, Brisket beside him, and reached the podium. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He placed his hand gently on Mira's, and the room erupted into applause, not just for her words, but for the silent courage beside them. Spring had settled over Edmonton like a long exhale. The snow was gone for good now, replaced by bursts of green and petals unfolding slowly across the parks. Trees once brittle from ice now swayed with bird song, and the morning air held the scent of thawed soil and new beginnings. Jonas sat at the small table in his apartment, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. Brisket curled beneath his feet like a sleeping ember. A stack of unopened mail sat beside him, as it often did, most of it junk or official things from the city. But today, something was different. There was an envelope without a return address, cream-colored and handwritten, addressed simply to Jonas Dale, the man who saved Brisket. Mira must have forwarded it. She handled most of the incoming messages since the fire. Jonas hesitated, his thumb tracing the edge of the flap. He looked down at Brisket, who twitched in his sleep, then carefully opened the letter. Inside was a folded sheet of plain paper. The handwriting was shaky, hesitant, with blots of ink where someone had clearly stopped and started again. Jonas read slowly. "Dear Jonas, You don't know us, but we know Brisket. We were the ones who left him, and we've hated ourselves for it ever since. We don't expect forgiveness. We just want to explain. Not as an excuse, but so you'll know he wasn't always unloved. We got Brisket when we thought our lives were coming together. My name's Tessa, and my husband is Brian. We were newly married, had a rental house, both had jobs. Brisket was our future. We loved him from the start. He chewed everything. He barked at crows. He used to sleep between us like a hot water bottle with legs. Then the layoffs came, and the rent doubled. Then the medical bills, for me. Then the eviction. We didn't know what to do. Shelters were full. Our car was stuffed with everything we owned, and Brisket couldn't come with us to the couch we were offered in someone's basement. I said we'd come back. I thought someone would find him. I thought he'd be safer out there than locked in a car. It was the worst decision we've ever made, and not a day goes by we don't wonder if he forgave us. Then we saw him on the news, older, limping, alive, and beside you, safe. Thank you for saving him, for giving him what we couldn't, for being better than we were. Sincerely, Tessa and Brian. Jonas sat very still. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional rattle of the heater. He folded the letter and placed it gently on the table. For a long time, he didn't move. He felt neither rage nor righteousness. Just weight. A long, old weight lifting. He didn't tell Mira about the letter right away. Instead, he took out a piece of paper from the drawer, the same kind he used when leaving notes for the vet, and began writing. Dear Tessa and Brian, I got your letter. I don't know if I'll ever send this. Maybe I'm just writing it for me. Brisket was hurt when I found him, real bad. I thought he might not make it, but he did. And since then, he's saved me more times than I can count. I don't know your story. Not fully. But I know what it's like to run out of choices. I know what it's like to make a mistake you carry for decades. He's safe now. He's loved. And you don't need to carry his pain anymore. I'm carrying it with him. That's enough. Jonas. He folded it, placed it in a drawer, and left it there. Not because he didn't mean it, but because some things were meant to be said, not sent. That same week, Jonas received another letter, this one hand-delivered by a woman from the senior center. The envelope was lavender, the handwriting precise and tidy. It was from Rose. She had passed away 2 nights earlier, peacefully in her sleep. Marvin the cat had been adopted by a neighbor, and Rose had left instructions for one specific item to be given to Jonas. A knitted scarf, pale blue and patched at the edges, still smelling faintly of peppermint and wool. With it came the letter. Jonas, thank you for sitting with me, for talking when you didn't want to, for reminding me that people like you still exist. I stopped believing in kindness a long time ago. Then I met you and your dog. This scarf is old and ugly, but it's warm. I hope it keeps you as warm as you made me feel in that waiting room. Tell Brisket he's a good boy. Love, Rose. Jonas held the scarf for a long time. Then he wrapped it around his neck, stepped outside with Brisket, and stood beneath the tree near the park where they first met Sammy. The air was light, full of fluttering blossoms, and he could hear children's voices in the distance. He took a deep breath. The letters were in his pocket, folded and safe. The dog was beside him, and the past, for the first time in his life, felt like something behind him rather than inside him. The grass had grown thick and green beneath the early June sun, soft as velvet beneath Brisket's paws. Edmonton's parks were alive with laughter, distant bike bells, and the rustling hush of trees finding their leaves again. Children darted between picnic tables. Dogs barked in the distance. And Jonas, now 46, stood beneath a tall birch with a leash looped loosely around his fingers, watching Brisket run. Not limp, not hobble, run. The German Shepherd was no longer the trembling, skeletal pup Jonas had cradled from the road over a year ago. He was fully grown now, sleek and powerful, his golden coat rippling in the wind, muscles long healed beneath fur that caught sunlight like fire. He chased a ball with the eager joy of a dog who had learned not just how to move, but how to trust the ground beneath him. Every few strides, he'd glance back over his shoulder to make sure Jonas was watching. He always was. Jonas had changed too. He still wore the same old boots, still walked with shoulders slightly hunched, as if expecting to be ignored. But now, when neighbors passed him in the park, he lifted his eyes and nodded. Sometimes he even smiled. He had become, quietly and without ceremony, part part of the landscape. The mobile shelter he'd started during the snowstorm was now an official partnership with Maple Paw's Rescue Trust, renamed Brisket's Bus, refitted with crates, storage, heating, and a logo hand-painted by a group of local students. It parked near the community center every weekend, where Mira volunteered with Jonas, and Brisket played ambassador to the newest rescues. Sometimes kids came just to see the hero dog from the fire. Brisket would greet them with a tail wag and a patient tongue. Jonas would stand at the side, shy but solid, grateful but quiet. They'd found their rhythm, and now, as Brisket trotted toward him, ball in his mouth, tail sweeping the air, Jonas laughed aloud, freely, without apology. The two of them continued their walk through the park, the leash unused. Brisket stayed close without needing command. They passed Sammy and his mom, Lena, sitting on a blanket eating ice cream sandwiches. Sammy waved, chocolate smudging his chin. Brisket licked it clean in one swoop. Lena laughed and tossed Jonas a napkin. "Dinner's at 6 tomorrow," she called. No excuses. Jonas smiled and nodded. Near the edge of the park, under a maple tree just beginning to flower, was a small wooden bench painted a fading blue. An elderly man sat there now, Mr. Granger, in his 80s, sharp-eyed but slow-moving, known for feeding the squirrels and arguing politics with anyone who lingered long enough. He raised a hand as Jonas passed. "You still got that scarf the old lady gave you?" Jonas tugged lightly at the pale blue knit wrapped around his neck, despite the summer breeze. Mr. Granger chuckled. "She'd be proud of you." Jonas nodded. I hope so." They turned the corner onto Sycamore Lane, where row houses stood in neat, aging rows. Jonas's place, once a faceless rental in a city of gray, had been transformed. The front porch now held potted herbs. A wind chime made from old keys tinkled softly by the door. The mailbox had a hand-painted nameplate that read, "Jonas and Brisket." On the porch stood Mira. She wore a sundress, her curls caught in the wind, a dish towel slung over one shoulder, and a wooden spoon in one hand. The scent of something warm, onions, thyme, and roast, drifted through the screen door. "There you are," she said, smiling as she stepped down the stairs. "I was about to send out a search party." Brisket bolted ahead, leapt onto the porch with the full force of love, and Mira crouched to greet him, both arms wrapping around his neck. "You're muddy again," she murmured. "Jonas, you're washing him before he even thinks about stepping inside." Yes, ma'am." Mira looked up and grinned. "Don't ma'am me. You still owe me for burning the toast yesterday." Jonas reached the bottom step and paused. He looked up, not at Mira, not at the house, but at everything. The fading pink in the sky, the lights flicking on behind nearby windows, the neighbor boy chasing a paper plane across the street, the dog beside him, the woman waiting for him, the silence inside his chest, where pain used to live. He closed his eyes for just a moment and whispered, "We made it home." Brisket nudged his leg. Mira held the door open, and Jonas stepped forward, into the warmth, into the light, into everything he'd thought he'd never deserve. In the quietest corners of life, between the broken barks of an abandoned dog and the silent footsteps of a lonely man, miracles still unfold, not with thunder or fire, but with a soft paw pressed against a wounded heart. Jonas didn't find Brisket by accident, and Brisket didn't survive by chance. Somewhere, in that snow-covered silence, a whisper from heaven reached down and said, "Not yet. There's still more love to be lived." Because sometimes God doesn't move mountains in front of us. He sends someone to walk beside us until we learn how to climb them ourselves. This story isn't just about a dog who healed. It's about a man who believed he was forgotten until he found that the greatest power of all wasn't in being strong. It was in choosing kindness, even when the world had been unkind. Maybe you're watching this in your own winter. Maybe you felt overlooked, unloved, or uncertain about your worth. But if a broken man and a limping dog can teach us anything, it's this. Grace doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it comes with muddy paws and second chances. So tonight, as you close this video, say a little prayer for the Jonases and Briskets of the world, those who are waiting for someone to see them, to save them, or simply to love them. May God bless you for watching. May He guide your steps toward compassion, even when it's hard, and may you always find your way home. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell us why. Like the video to help it reach others who may need a little hope today. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us how powerful love and faith can be. And until next time, may you be safe, may you be seen, and may you be blessed.